Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust. Welcome to History 1301, U.S. History to 1877. Welcome back to lecture number 14. This is our first lecture in module number 3, so the home stretch for the semester. This is the beginning of material that will take you to the final exam. Now, in our last module, the last moments of the last lecture, I talked about a few things that had to do with Andrew Jackson and had to do with the question of what type of president he was going to be and how we were going to see things that were related to the institution of slavery. Now, that was the issue of Indian removal. But two more things happened in Andrew Jackson's presidency that we need to deal with in order to get us to where we want to be. The first one of those issues was nullification. Nullification was a huge crisis for the Jackson presidency, and it was about the tariff that gets passed in 1828. Americans paid for government in a much different way than they pay for government today. There was no income tax, and the United States paid for most of its functioning via the tariff, a tax on imported goods. But Southern slaveholders really disliked tariffs. They exported cotton, and other countries tended to retaliate against American sellers for these types of tariffs, so they would retaliate with their own tariffs. So Southern cotton growers, and to be fair, Southern tobacco growers and rice growers, sugar growers, were also worried about retaliatory tariffs, but they're also worried about tariffs for another reason. It doesn't just cut into their profitability, but it also means that these people, Southern cotton growers or Southern tobacco growers or Southern rice growers or sugar farmers, they only grow one thing. They grow tobacco or they grow rice or sugar or cotton. They don't do things that allow them to manufacture their own goods. They are fully invested in the agricultural commodity business. So they're dependent on others for manufactured goods. That means they're dependent on manufacturers for things for their roof, like roof shingles. They're dependent for nails. They're dependent for furniture. They're dependent on any sort of manufactured good you can think of. They need manufacturers to provide these for them, to make them, and to do so at the lowest consumer prices possible. And as Southerners saw this, it artificially created a marketplace in the United States. Northerners were the ones who were the manufacturers, and without competition from foreign manufacturers, Northerners could basically charge whatever they wanted for this stuff. Southerners looked at this and said, no, we want as much competition in here because competition drives prices down. So that's what they want. Now, a tariff was always around. There was always a tariff passed to pay for the functions of government. But in 1828, a new tariff gets passed called the Tariff of Abominations. This is a massive tax. It's enormous. The rate of this tax was beyond anything that anyone had ever seen before in the United States. So Southerners were really upset about this. Now, to kind of jump to the end of this, Southerners are going to wind up protesting all of this stuff. They're going to demand that tariff of abominations be removed. And ultimately, in 1831, Congress passes a new tariff that will take effect in 1832 to replace this tariff of abominations. And oddly enough, it actually kind of hurts Southerners too, but they're interested in the rate. The 1832 tariff will actually have a lower rate, but it applies to more goods. So it could be argued that it actually hurt Southerners more than the, quote, tariff of abominations. But what's important here is not that the tariff gets created and then Southerners get angry and it gets lowered. It's how they get to this point. It's what they do to convince Northerners that this tariff must change. Southerners began arguing for a doctrine called nullification. Now, the doctrine of nullification is not a strange one. The roots of nullification are in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that we talked about much earlier in the semester when we talked about the position of states' rights that Jefferson and Madison were carving out. The states have a right to declare a law to be null and void within those states. So nullification is a logical extension of that states' rights position. What's unique here in terms of nullification is the man who's responsible for promoting it. The person responsible is John C. Calhoun, who is actually Andrew Jackson's own vice president. Now, nullification, remember, says essentially that a state has a right to nullify laws within its boundary. The argument dates back to something that's called the compact theory. The individual states created a compact or an agreement, that being the Constitution, which created the government. And since it's an agreement among equals, each one of those equals can say, we're not going to take part in this part of the agreement, of the overall agreement. We're not going to enforce this law in our territory. Now, Calhoun's own home state of South Carolina said this. They said, we disagree with the tariff, and we are not going to enforce the tariff laws. However, they had chosen, on some level, they had chosen the wrong president to mess with. Andrew Jackson had killed, if you remember back to the last lecture, he had killed 12 men in duels. So he was not afraid of this. When Southerners stood up and said, we're not going to take this, Jackson basically said, yes, you will. I'm in charge here. I'm the president. You'll do what I say. When South Carolina announced their position regarding the tariff, he declared that he would organize an army, lead it personally into South Carolina to force them to comply with the law, and that he would then hang all opposition leaders. Now, to give him, just like he did with the Native American removal plan, he gets Congress to give him the legal authority to do this. He gets Congress to pass something called the Force Act, which empowered him to use force against South Carolina to insist on compliance with federal laws. Now, this is, whether people realize this or not at the moment, this is an enormous precedent. You have a president of the United States stepping in, telling Congress, I want you to pass a law that will allow me to use force to make a state comply with federal law. This would suggest, this creates a precedent that the Union is inviolable, that you can't just say, I'm going to opt out of this thing. I'm just going to decide what parts of it I agree with and other parts that I don't. And if I don't like it, I'm just going to opt out. You cannot opt out, because if you can actually opt out, then secession is potentially legitimate. And to underscore all of this stuff, South Carolina even starts talking about secession, saying that if Jackson tries all this stuff, maybe we'll secede from the Union. Now, that's one part of this. This is the precedent part of this that is really critically important. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, though, once again, steps in and tries to resolve this. The Speaker of the House is Henry Clay, the same Henry Clay that came up with the Missouri Compromise when we talked about all of that stuff dating back to the 18 teens and heading into the 1820s. He comes up with a compromise that avoids a potential war, that avoids Jackson having to go down and utilize the Force Act, that forestalls any secession issues. The solution is, as I mentioned at the top of this, is to reduce tariffs to the pre-1828 levels. Now, that means the tax rate actually goes down. But as I mentioned, there's more goods that are actually subject to tariffs. But the way the South looks at this, there is no question how the South looked at this. The South looked at this as face saving. They looked at this and they said, our ideals won. The government created this tariff. We did not want the tariff. We stood up to the federal government, and in the end, the federal government backed down. They reduced the tariff. So it's kind of hard to argue that they're wrong on that front. It's kind of hard to argue that their ideals didn't win out, because it would seem that their ideals did, in fact, win out. And on top of this, again, to underscore what they're doing, to underscore that nullification and states' rights is legitimate, South Carolina's legislature, in kind of a final feudal gesture to Andrew Jackson, actually passed a resolution that, quote, nullified the Force Act, basically saying this law will prohibit you from using force against South Carolina. So they're really doing this purely to stick it to Andrew Jackson, to kind of poke him in the eye here. So in the end, the South kind of wins here. And Andrew Jackson, oddly enough, Andrew Jackson also kind of looked at this as a victory for the South. Andrew Jackson was bitter about this whole thing until his dying days, when he wrote his last day, when he wrote in his journal in his last days as a preparation for publishing a memoir. Jackson wrote that his greatest regret in life was that he didn't hang John C. Calhoun or horsewhip Henry Clay. Now, all of that is a great story. It's important in its own right. It's important from the standpoint of precedent. It's important from the standpoint of taxation. But there's an underlying issue here that I've been telling you all semester long we need to be on the lookout for. That we're going to have all of these things that on the surface do not appear to be about slavery. But then when we start pulling the layers back, it's about slavery. And this is no different. This is one of those moments. So we have to look at it through that lens to figure out why the South is actually coming up with a doctrine like states' rights and utilizing it through nullification. Now, as I had mentioned in a previous class, in 1831, there was a slave insurrection in Jamaica. Now, I only mention it in passing. I said that it's the biggest one outside of Haiti, and as successful as it was, it convinced the British Empire, or the British government, that they need to do something. They need to abolish slavery, not end the slave trade, but end slavery, period. And over a 2-year period, the British Empire is successful in abolishing, via the law, abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. Now, the implementation process is a little bit longer, but the laws are actually written within a 2-year period that abolishes slavery across the British Empire. And more importantly, they do it with compensation to the slave owners. So it's a little bit different than American abolition, which said immediate uncompensated emancipation. So Southerners are watching this. They see that England and the British Empire have ended slavery via compensation throughout the entirety of their empire. And that's a huge empire, by the way. So that's one thing. I also talked about Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner's rebellion was a big thing. And of course, I'm not going to tell you what Nat Turner's rebellion is. You're going to have to read about it in the Fires of Jubilee. But understand that the Nat Turner rebellion scared the hell out of Virginians for a couple of reasons. By all accounts, remember, he had been well treated. By his own account, he had been well treated. This convinced slave owners in the South that if a guy like Nat Turner, if a slave like Nat Turner might rebel, then any slave would rebel. If slaves who are treated well rebel against slavery, God help us if we run into the slaves who are poorly treated. So the South is looking at this, and they see Jamaican slave rebellions. They see England ending slavery as a consequence. They see a slave rebellion right here in the United States, and they go, slavery is under attack all around us. So we must close ranks around the institution in order to protect the institution. Now, they feel threatened, but they're also not dumb. They realize that something we're about to talk about, the massive amounts of immigration to the United States means that northern populations are surging ahead of the South, which is giving the North an advantage in the House of Representatives. The South believes that sooner rather than later, Northerners and anti-slavery people will have the votes to try to abolish slavery. So what Southerners need is a tactic, and more importantly, a precedent that will allow them to say, we can do what we want. You cannot touch slavery. And nullification and the tariff provides all of this for them. If the federal government can tax them and force them to accept it, then how could we possibly stop slavery? That's their rationale. So when they are able to use nullification and use it successfully, they say, this is it. This is how we will effectively resist any attempt to end slavery. Nullification is how we will do it. And the problem for North Carolina, and I just mentioned this kind of tangentially here a couple of minutes ago. South Carolina is a, quote, true believer, if you will. They're saying, if you don't let us do what we want with slavery, we will secede. The problem is that they're all on their own on this front. While a number of other southern states are kind of behind them going, yeah, us too, we agree. They're not willing to go as far as South Carolina and say, yes, we will secede too if you don't allow us to keep slaves. So that's a problem. That whole issue is a problem that the United States is dealing with that, again, on the surface, nothing to do with slavery. You start peeling the layers back, it's got everything to do with slavery. Now, next issue that we need to deal with Andrew Jackson's presidency is the so-called bank war. Now, today, if we were to look at money, most money in our monetary system looks more or less the same. There's obviously a difference between a $10 bill and a $20 bill and things like that. But generally, there's sort of a unifying theme across money. But that's not the case during the 1820s and 1830s. And the reason for this is that while the Constitution had given the national government the power to control currency in this country, what the federal government had settled for was for regulation of the currency supply. They printed their own banknotes, but they also told individual banks across the country that so long as you follow our rules about doing it, you can print your own bank notes. Now, bank notes functioned essentially like a gold certificate, if you will. If you see on the screen here, you've got all of these $10 and $5 notes from these various banks. And what they represented was, if a person went into a bank and deposited, say, $100 worth of gold in the bank would then give them, like the Bank of the United States or the Bank of Chattahoochee or the Farmers Bank of, let's see, where is that from? Perry, Georgia. You go in and you deposit $100 worth of gold. They're going to give you banknotes totaling $100 so that you don't have to carry the gold around with you to buy goods and services. You can carry the banknotes around with you. Now, theoretically, having that banknote in your hand would allow you to go into the bank, if you're a merchant, and somebody comes up to you and pays you with a $5 bill from the Insurance Bank of Columbus. Theoretically, you could go to your bank and redeem it for $5 worth of gold, and then your bank would then at some point present it to the Insurance Bank of Columbus, and they'd get their gold back, and everybody would be happy. That's how they balanced their books. But the reality is that there are 325 different banks that are printing currency during this period. And banking then, just like today, was, let's just call it deregulated. There were there were virtually no regulations during this era on banking. So banks rose up, and many of them stuck around. Many of them remained in business for years and years and years. But a lot of banks went bust. And if a bank went bust, then those denominations, those drafts, those paper currency were worthless. Okay, you've heard the phrase, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. That relates to this sort of stuff. So a smart person, if they were going to be dealing in currency, a smart person would try to use as many different currency types as they could, because it's almost impossible for anybody to keep track of what currencies are good, what currencies are not, what currencies have been devalued, what currencies are overinflated, whatever. Okay, it's almost impossible to do this. Now, strangely enough, even though banks wanted the ability to issue their own currency and issue their own notes, they really hated this system because there were no guarantees. If they got stuck with a bad bill, they were just out of luck. That was a loss for them. So private banks actually wound up hating this whole thing. Now, a strange thing happened along the way to the 1830s. Jackson was very much an uneducated guy. He had believed that banks existed solely to take money away from people. And as far as the Bank of the United States goes, Jackson was a doctrinaire Jeffersonian. He believed that the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. However, his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Nicholas Biddle, did not see things that way. Nicholas Biddle believed that the Bank of the United States formed a very important part of the economics of this country. And when the bank came up for rechartering, Biddle tried to get Congress, or did get Congress, to pass a bank rechartering bill so that there would not be a fight over the bank in Congress. The thought was, look, it had worked really well during the War of 1812, so even though we didn't like it, in 1815, Congress passed the Bank Rechartering Act for an additional 20 years. So it's due to expire in 1835. But here's the fly in the ointment for all of this stuff. Andrew Jackson, remember, he does not agree with Biddle about the use of the bank, about the constitutionality of the bank, nothing. Jackson had won a re-election in 1832, and he had won overwhelmingly. So when Biddle comes in with this bill saying, hey, guess what? Congress passed the Bank Reauthorization Act. If you could sign it, we don't have to worry about any of this stuff for the next 20 years. Jackson says, no. I was elected overwhelmingly, and he was, make no mistake about it. He won the election of 1832 easily. He says, I was elected overwhelmingly. That means the people see things the way I do. There will be no bank rechartering. And Jackson vetoes the bank bill. Now, this plunges the United States' economy into uncertainty. Now, it doesn't plunge it into a depression just yet, just uncertainty, because everybody knows that in 1835, the Bank of the United States will cease to exist. So what happens to all of the money that the United States has? What happens to all of our gold? What will happen if the United States Treasury takes in money from, say, public land sales, which they do all the time? What is going to happen here? Well, Jackson figures this is very simple. When the bank, in preparation of the bank ceasing to exist, what Jackson does is he simply starts to withdraw money from the Bank of the United States and place it in various private banks across the country, which was not done with any sort of logic, was not done with any sort of rationality. I don't want to make it sound like Jackson's crazy and running around like a madman. I'm just saying he doesn't have a plan for all of this. He's just going, we're going to put some in here, and we're going to put some in here, we're going to put some in here. But he doesn't have a plan. And then he also gets Congress to pass 2 new pieces of legislation for him. When the midterm elections roll around, Jackson wins a huge victory in Congress. There are way more Democrats in the House of Representatives than there had been before. So what they pass is something called the Currency Circular. The Currency Circular removes all denominations of currency greater than $5 from the circulating cash in the United States. What this had the effect of doing, the Currency Circular, by removing all of these denominations, it had the function of decreasing the monetary supply. Now, Congress also passes something called the Specie Act. The Specie Act required that all public lands be paid for in gold and in silver. So if you were a person who had been saving up money and saving up money and you had a bunch of these banknotes and you were going to go into the U.S. Land and Patents Office and say, I would like to buy those 100 acres over there, and you plop your money down, they're going to tell you, unless you've got gold or silver, you cannot buy this land. That's what specie is. Specie is hard currency, gold, or actual silver. Okay. So what the Specie Act also did was it had the function, by having people come in and outlay physical gold, it also had the function of decreasing the monetary supply. Now, here's a funny thing. Well, it's not really funny. I shouldn't say funny. That's the wrong word. It's a strange thing about how this works from an economic standpoint. If the monetary supply goes down, okay, what that means is that the value of the money actually goes up. Okay, that shouldn't be a surprise to you guys. That's just straight up supply and demand. So on some level, currency is not that hard to figure out. It is kind of a supply and demand thing. If the supply of currency goes down, the value of it goes up. Just like if we produce fewer pencils in this country, it means that there are fewer pencils to go around, so the price of a pencil will go up. But here's the thing. I didn't say the price, right? I said the value, okay? So values of currency go up. There's a third line when it comes to currency. When the value of currency is high, it takes less of that currency to buy consumer goods. So consumer prices decline as a result, okay? So when the currency supply goes down, the value of the currency goes up and consumer prices go down. But there's a flip side to this. What I just described to you is deflation. There is massive deflation in the United States, beginning or traceable to the Currency Act and the Specie Act, because what both of them did was take money out of circulation. It took money out of the monetary supply. Now, the flip side, as many of you probably know, is inflation. Okay? And there's a reason why I say it's the flip side, right? I just did this one for you. The currency supply goes down, the value goes up, consumer prices go down. Well, if you flip it over, had to check there. If you flip it over, monetary supply goes up, the value of currency comes down, so it's worth less. It's literally worthless currency. It's worth less, so consumer prices go up because it takes more of that worthless currency to buy goods. So, either way, whether you have inflation or deflation, an extreme in both of them is no good for the economy, and particularly in this type of an economy here. Deflation is bad for commodity sellers. For a consumer, it's very good. A consumer can look at their money and go, my money goes further. I can buy more stuff. But for the commodity seller, it's bad because it means I'm bringing in less money, which means I'm bringing in less in terms of profits, which mean I'm going to have problems here. Cotton prices over the in the aftermath of the currency circular, they just plummet. They fall through the floor. All sorts of other commodities prices begin to decline. Manufactured goods, the prices of those decline, which means manufacturers have less money. When they have less money, they start laying off their employees. And the end result of all of this is something called the Panic of 1837. But here's the crazy part about all of this. Andrew Jackson's term in office expired in March of 1837. He was not running for re-election. In 1836, his virtually hand-picked protege, Martin Van Buren, ran for president. And when Van Buren ran as a quote, handpicked candidate of Jackson, and then comes into office and says, basically, I'm going to maintain Jackson's policies. Well, doing that means the economy collapsed under Van Buren's watch. But the policies were actually created under Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, though, somehow historians gave Andrew Jackson a pass and put it all on Martin Van Buren, unfairly, I might add. But Van Buren, it's going to basically kill his presidency. He's going to serve one term, and he goes out of office in 1844 as one of the least popular presidents in American history. Okay, I mentioned that we'd be getting to immigration before too long, and we're here now, so we really need to get at immigration. Immigration is a critically important moment in American mid-century history, middle of the 19th century history. It's an incredibly causative issue during this period. Now, prior to the 1830s, immigration is not a particularly big issue. If we look, and I'm not going to test you on the actual numbers here, so don't panic about trying to remember, which decade has more people coming. Just look at the numbers here. In the first decades of the 1800s, this nation does not have a ton of immigrants coming in. Now, it is a nation of immigrants. It's a nation of people who had come over from England and France and Spain and all these other places, the Netherlands and various German principalities. But by the time the country exists, inbound migration has largely trickled to a slow. About 5,000 people per year throughout the early decades of the 1800s. But then in 1830, we start seeing a change. Throughout that decade, immigration increases to an average of 50,000 people per year. In the 1840s, that number triples, an average of 150,000 people per year. And then in the 1850s, that number doubles again to an average of about 300,000 people per year. So there is massive inbound migration to the United States in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what's remarkable about it is that if we look at the North, by 1860, with all of this massive amount coming in, about 20% of the Northeast's population was immigrant in nature. But what's even more striking is what we see in the largest cities in this country. Just again, look at the totals here. Boston, about half of the population is immigrant in nature. In New York City, about 75% is immigrant in nature. In Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Providence, Rhode Island, more than 50% is immigrant in nature. So this literally changes the face of the United States. And there are two big effects of this. The first I already mentioned. The North's population is surging ahead of the South. Virtually all of the immigration to the country is coming through the northern ports. It's not coming into southern ports. So the North's population is surging ahead of the South. Secondly, for the first time, many urban areas in the United States are seeing a phenomena that native-born Americans, that's different than Native Americans. Native Americans, capital N, capital A, those are indigenous peoples, the Indians. Native-born Americans means American citizens who were actually born in the United States. And what we see, courtesy of this massive amount of immigration, is that native-born Americans in many of the nation's cities are in a minority. Okay, and under the best of circumstances, you guys can see this in the modern world, that prior to COVID, we didn't have particularly great circumstances in this country, but they were never as bad as what we see in this particular era. And what we have in common with this era is a massive attack on immigration. There's a huge attack, and it's because of the sort of lack of understanding, the rapid changes that are happening in the United States, and the tensions that were created because of this massive amount of immigration. Now, what I mean by that is is if we look at this particular era, immigrants who came to the United States and who had skills and capital did what was kind of the American story. They came in through one of these port cities, and if they had money or if they had skills, they wound up very quickly moving out to the West. They did not stay in the urban areas around the various port cities. They left for the West. The plan was that they'd utilize those skills, they'd take that capital, and they'd buy land, and they'd go out and become individual family homesteaders. Okay. However, those who stayed in the nation's urban areas, particularly in the Northeast, these were people who were unskilled, meaning they didn't have a trade. Doesn't mean that they're dumb. Unskilled means, in this context, means they don't have a trade. So they're not a mechanic, or they're not a glass blower, or they're not a candle maker, or whatever. Okay, they don't have a trade to fall back on. Many of these people were illiterate, and they had very little money. So when they came in, they start taking the lowest paying jobs. They start living in the worst conditions in the nation's cities. The largest single group of these immigrants were Irish people, and they were sort of the bane of American antagonism during this era, an antagonism that's specifically aimed against immigrants. The dwellings that they lived in were the worst of slum conditions. They lacked air, they lacked ventilation, they were in every way, to use a modern term, quote, substandard. They were considered, because of the lack of ventilation, because of the dire poverty and filth around the area, they were considered to be a breeding ground for disease, a breeding ground for, quote, poverty, crime, and alcoholism. So not really that much different than the way people argue about immigration in the modern era. But there's something else that these Irish had that was a strike against them, and it was that they were Catholic. In the eyes of all of those Protestant revivalists that I've talked about in previous classes, these Irish Catholics practiced a false religion. Now, this, again, the Catholic Church may be the, quote, universal church, but the United States was not populated by a lot of Catholics prior to this point. Catholicism was relatively rare in the United States prior to this Irish migration. So, given that the Irish are this group that is largely illiterate, unskilled, the poorest of the poor, they're taking these domestic jobs that are live-in domestic jobs. The men are taking incredibly low-paying manual labor jobs. And on top of that, they're Catholic. Given all of these strikes against them, why on earth would the Irish come to the United States? And make no mistake, they come in enormous numbers to the United States. Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. In the summer of 1845, the Irish began to harvest their potato crop. The potato was the basic staple of the Irish diet, and they would take these out of the ground, they would store them. Then a few days later, when they would return to, start drawing from the crop, from their produce, they would find that the potatoes had rotted, they were starting to turn black, and they were liquefying, or as the term went, they were, quote, melting. There was no consensus early on about what was causing any of this. There seemed to be nothing wrong with the crop that was being put in the ground. There seemed to be nothing wrong with the farming techniques of the Irish. There was just no understanding. So it led to theories that kind of didn't make sense. For example, one expert thought that there was either a problem with too much static in the environment around Ireland, or that there was too much industrial smoke getting its way into Ireland. Another argument went that there was an underground volcano that was actually burning the potatoes while they were in the ground. For those of you who don't know this, potatoes grow right in the ground. So there was no real explanation for what caused it. But what actually did cause it, it was discovered much, much later. A fungus had actually infested the potato crop, and this fungus originated in Central America. So here we are in 1845, and we're still seeing new ramifications of the Columbian Exchange, something that dated back to the 1490s and the early 1500s. So the Columbian Exchange is still playing a role here. Now, families, and why are they growing potatoes? Why is this the basic mode of subsistence for Irish people? Well, families in Ireland had incredibly high birth rates, and they continually divided family plots. What this meant is that most families were trying to support themselves and feed themselves and their children on less than 1/3 of an acre of land. Now, given that they have these very tiny plots of land with which they can grow food to feed themselves and their families, potatoes were about the only thing they could grow, because you can grow potatoes in virtually any condition. They do not require a lot of TLC like tobacco does. You can kind of just stick it in the ground and let it be. It also is an incredibly productive crop in terms of the yield per acre. So when these people looked at this, at what to grow for subsistence, potatoes were the answer. It was far better for them to grow potatoes than it was, for example, to grow a cereal grain or to grow corn or something like that. So they're growing potatoes to the point that they are subsisting on virtually nothing but potatoes. So when the crop fails, bottom drops out in Ireland. It kills people. Literally 750,000 people are going to starve to death courtesy of the Irish potato famine. Another 2 million are going to emigrate from Ireland to elsewhere within the world, to the point that within 5 years of the Irish potato famine, by 1850, 25% of the Irish population in Ireland was gone, either dead or had emigrated outside of Ireland. Now, this famine, as it was, is something that we often think of in terms of natural disasters, but it didn't have to be this way. A lot of people in Ireland were incredibly angry about the Irish potato famine. We often use natural disaster as a term to remove human involvement. Okay, it was nature that did this. There was nothing these people could have done. But the reality is that while there was nothing anybody could have done about the fungus that made it to Ireland, the policies that the British enacted during the famine actually made the situation much, much worse in Ireland. It was they looked at Ireland and said, well, all we've got to do to fix this problem is to get more people to grow cereal grains or to subsist on cereal grains. So what we're going to do is we're going to just essentially open the marketplace to cereal grains, to flood cereal grains into Ireland. Now, what all this did was kill off the Irish Irish market of cereal grains. People who were actually growing cereal grains in Ireland saw those commodity prices drop, and they too wound up starving to death. So Ireland saw all of this stuff and saw it turn much, much worse as a consequence of all of this stuff. That's where we're going to stop for this particular lecture. In the next class, we're going to be dealing with the development of American expansion or manifest destiny. And we're going to tie it to all of this sort of stuff, and we're going to tie it to some other things within pop culture. So please come back for lecture 15.